Hey everyone, it's Nissa. Today we're going to be talking about summary, paraphrase, and quotation as an overview to 3 source integration methods that will be key for you as you approach this next essay, the summary critique unit. So let's take a look at the 3 methods. First, how do you integrate sources into your paper? We discussed in the previous essay, the diagnostic, that with any point, illustration, explanation pairing, you want to have an illustration that will ideally exemplify the point that you're trying to make. So when you find the source or the evidence or the example that you want to use, how do you successfully and appropriately and accurately put it into your paper? There are 3 methods of doing this, and you should choose one of these 3. The first is summary. A summary is of a shorter length than the original work. It's usually much shorter. And it uses different words, your writer's, your own words, the writer's own words. The second method is paraphrase, which is the same length or slightly shorter or comparable to length to the original work. And again, uses different words. It uses your own words, not the author's original words that you're using. It uses your own. And the last is quotation. You're probably the most familiar with this method, is just directly citing from the source, putting whatever it is that they said into quotation, and then of course you would know that this is the same length, the same words. You can maybe omit a few words, a sentence if you like, but ideally you're not going to be using your own words when you're quoting. So now, if you'd like to, on the course site, there's the Purdue OWL chart linked. If you want to follow along on your own screen, that might work, or you can follow along with me here. So to go a little bit more in depth about these 3 methods, we're going to talk about summarizing first, then paraphrasing and quoting. And we'll discover a little later on in the lesson that this is really the order that you should consider these 3 methods. First, try and summarize if you can't, try and paraphrase if you can't, then you would quote. So we'll go into a little bit more in depth into each of these. A summary, you would take the main ideas from a source and put them into your own words. This is much shorter than the original. The classic example of a summary is if a friend asks you what a movie was about. You don't go through every single scene and tell them what every single scene was about. You would just pick the main points and explain those to your friend, just so that they can get a better idea of the general idea of the movie, the general plot of the movie. You wouldn't give them more of the supporting details. You might pick out the more interesting supporting details if they maybe make your movie review a bit more interesting, but ideally you would just focus on the main points. And that's the same for any kind of a summary. The reason you would summarize is to, again, get the main idea from a source. You would leave out the unnecessary details when the main point is all that you need. If you just want to talk about a scholar's idea that they brought up or a theory that they brought up, then you would just give us the overview of that idea. You wouldn't give us how they got there, what sources they used, what problems they had, unless those were really important and relevant to what it is that you're trying to argue. And of course, this would give your audience a general introduction to the source, not a really in-depth understanding, but basically just the basic understanding, just what they need to know what it's going to be about. So how would you do this? You'll read it very carefully. You want to make sure that when you summarize, you want to maintain the meaning that's presented in the original work. So you don't want to change it just to make it fit better with your argument. You want to make sure that the meaning is the same. So you might take some notes about the original work, some notes about the main ideas, and then you'll set it aside. I think this is one of the best ways to help students write summaries is if they have the original work with them, it's really important to put it away. I think when you have the original work next to you, it's very tempting to go and say, oh, what was that word that they used, because that was a really good word. Well, that's no longer summarizing. So it's always a good idea to put the original work away and just work from your memory. Because the other thing is if you're just working from your memory, you're more likely to just remember the most important points. If you can't think of a very minor detail that happened, it's likely that that point is not really necessary to reiterate in your summary. So the points that really stick in your mind are the ones that belong in your summary. How do you document a summary in terms of citation with MLA, APA, Chicago styles? The different requirements for documentation are going to rely on the style that you're using. So for this class, for ESL 501, you're going to want to make sure that you understand documentation for APA style. You might have a different documentation style in your discipline, and when you're writing papers in your discipline, I strongly encourage you to figure out what citation style is used in your discipline. But for this class, we'll use APA. For some documentation styles, page numbers may or may not be required for summary, and that's something that you're going to have to pay attention to when you're looking at your citation styles. The second method we're going to discuss is paraphrasing. So paraphrasing is again a lot like summary. You're putting a passage from a source into your own words. It's ideally shorter than the original work. It may be more broad or less specific than the original work, but it's comparable or similar in length to the original work. It's not like a summary, which is significantly shorter. A paraphrase is very similar in length to the original work. When would you paraphrase? There's two scenarios in which you would ideally paraphrase. The main idea here is to just get the main idea of what they're saying, not necessarily the same wording or how they phrased it. You really just want to focus on the main idea. So in one scenario is where the exact words are not necessarily important. Maybe you know of this theory from a scholar that you want to use, and you just have the main idea in your head, and it's not really phrased in any kind of an interesting or important way. You could definitely use that opportunity to find your own words to re-articulate that same idea, and that would be paraphrasing, which is perfectly fine. And in fact, a good instance to paraphrase. The second situation is where the exact words of your source are not necessarily appropriate for the style in which you're writing. A good example of this is maybe you want to use information from an encyclopedia or from a technical manuscript or an academic paper, that maybe that language is too elevated or too specific. A word we'd use here is there's too much jargon in the original. So then in that instance, you'd want to make it easier for your reader to understand by using simpler words so that they can more easily understand your point. That would be another really good instance to paraphrase. You can also paraphrase if the section that you want to use is simply too long for your paper, and you just want to trim down some of the information. Maybe you just want to focus on a few key parts of a paragraph. That would be another good instance to paraphrase. So how would you paraphrase? This is very similar to the method used for summary. So you want to read your original work very, very carefully. Make sure you have a really good understanding of what it's about, because again, we don't want to change the main idea when we go from the original work to the paraphrase. You want to make sure that the meaning is the same throughout. And also with paraphrase, I recommend the same technique as we used for summary, is that you put the original work away when you're going to start paraphrasing. If you have it next to you, it gets really tempting to use the same phrasing or the same wording of the original author. And if you're doing that and you're not using quotation marks, that gets you into trouble quite quickly, because that's actually when you should be quoting, is when you want to use the exact words. So be very careful to use your own words in a paraphrase. And a really good way of making sure that you do that is to put the original work away, because you no longer have the original words in front of you and you have to work from your memory. In terms of documentation, it's similar to a summary in that it's going to rely on the citation style that you're using. You're going to want to cite where the information came from. Where did you get this piece of knowledge? Quotation marks may not be necessary unless, again, you're quoting a specific phrase that's used in the original, or maybe there's a really unique word that the original used and you want to quote that. That's when you would use quotation marks. And page numbers are optional for paraphrase in some citation styles, so you're going to want to make sure that whatever citation style you're working in, you abide by those rules.